So I ended the previous video by basically saying that it's just not that easy to distinguish between these ANA grade angiosperms and the Magnoliids, at least not based on any easily recognizable characteristics. But on the other hand, it is a very learnable skill to be able to place most flowering plants as belonging to one of three main groupings. You have the ANA grade plants together with the Magnoliids. Basically, you can sort of draw that circle there and say I can pretty reliably place a plant within this group or within the monocots or within the eudicots. And I can do this based entirely on a quick visual inspection of the plant. And so what we're going to do next is to point out some characteristics that might point you in the direction of this group, the Magnoliid/ANA grade plants, which, as I said before, tend to have more primitive characteristics, and we'll talk about what I mean by that later. Now, this list probably isn't as complete as it could be, and the real world offers many, many exceptions, but here we go anyways. So here's my list. Characters suggesting a basal placement. That means an ANA grade or Magnoliid placement. Number 1. The leaves of Magnoliids and ANA grade angiosperms are simple and entire. And a good example of this would be the avocado leaf. Now, by a simple leaf, what I mean is that it's not a compound leaf. It's just one entire leaf, and that's it. Okay? A non-simple leaf might be something like this. Let's see if you can. You can't really see the whole picture there, but this entire thing, starting from right here, this is a leaf base, and the entire thing, this is one whole leaf. And these guys, individual ones, you might call these leaves, but they're actually leaflets. They're individual units of what would otherwise be a compound leaf. And there really aren't any members of the Magnoliids or ANA grade plants that have those compound leaves. They all are simple. Now, the other feature that we're talking about here is that they have entire or smooth margins. And this avocado has got a nice smooth margin leaf, but the entire margin rule is sometimes violated by plants in the Magnoliids. For example, this is Liriodendron, or the tulip tree, which is also in the Magnoliids. Sassafras leaves are also similarly not that simple elliptical shape. Okay, and so yeah, there are some exceptions. Liriodendron is one. Another exception would be Schisandra. On first glance, you might say, well, this has got a smooth margin, but if you look really carefully, you can actually see that there are little teeth, regularly spaced teeth, which is not a characteristic of an entire margin. So this would be one with a tooth margin, and yeah, that's I know it's a little detailed, but as we're looking at these plants and trying to identify the characteristics that lead us to conclude that they are part of one of these basal groupings, this type of leaf would not be pointing us in that direction, even though this plant actually does turn out to be from the Austerbaileales. But yeah, the majority of these plants have simple, elliptically shaped leaves with smooth margins. Okay, number 2. The flower has many individual pistils that are unfused. And the pistil, if you remember, is the carpellate structure, the part that contains the ovules. Now look at this magnolia flower. So the part of the flower that's out here at the very tip, this area from there to there, that's the female part. It's where you have the carpel enclosed ovules. And in this flower, each enclosed ovule forms its own pistil. Okay. Now I'm going to zoom in. I'll show you that even clearer. So let's magnify this. Zoom in. Bigger, 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 bigger. And you can see here this structure there, all the way to there. Right? That is an enclosed ovule. The carpel is inside of that. This is a stigma. This is where the pollen grains are going to land. The pollen tubes are going to grow through that and fertilize the ovule that's down there. Right? Now, in other kinds of plants, let's zoom out again. Now, in other kinds of plants, those carpels are going to fuse together with other carpels to create a kind of a common chamber within which the ovules will mature and develop into seeds. Okay, that's not happening here. Each carpel is individual. And this is another characteristic that we find in the Magnoliids as well as the ANA grade angiosperms. Okay, here's a picture of Ambarella, and again you can see that each individual structure here, 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 and here represents a separate pistil. And I don't think there are any exceptions to this. I think that when you do have multiple ovules in a single flower, they do tend to be unfused in all these. It's probably without exception, although there are going to be some other plants that also have unfused carpels. Now, if you look really carefully at this ambarella, you can actually see another structure. This part here is what I identified as a carpel. There's one there, there's another one there, there's another one here. And this structure over here, this is a non-functional stamen. And I know that it's non-functional because it lacks any pollen-bearing anthers. Okay? If this were a functional stamen, there would be a pollen-bearing anther right around here. And we don't see that, and this tells me that this is a male flower. Ambarella is a dioecious plant. Remember what that means? It's got male and female plants separate. And a female plant will have flowers that look like this, while a male plant will have flowers that have stamens only, and the stamens will be complete, and they'll have the pollen-bearing anthers at the very tip. Now, another thing that we can see from this is that the stamens of even these non-functional stamens on ambarella are flattened. They're very different from the typical structure that we find in most types of flowering plants, which is a stamen with a filamentous stalk. It kind of looks like this. It'll be a single filament, and then the pollen-bearing anther will be at the very tip. This really narrow filament is a derived characteristic. And as it turns out, this is going to be our third characteristic of ANA grade and Magnoliid angiosperms. Okay. You already saw the ambarella. This one here is Austrabalia. Austrabalia is an ANA plant. You can see the flattened stamens, and this one actually has a pollen-bearing anther there. And this flower is one that would be perfect. It has both stamens and carpels on the same plant. Okay. Here is a water lily, and you could see as well in this guy that the stamens are flattened. They're laminar as opposed to being filamentous. And this is another characteristic that is, again, it's not always going to be true, but if you do see flattened stamens, the plant that has those stamens is likely going to be a Magnoliid or an ANA grade plant. Now this is a good time for me to remind you that all the flower parts, the petals, the sepals, the stamens, and even the carpels are derived from leaves. They're modified leaves. And leaves are flat, right? So a flat stamen like this is just a little bit closer to its original state relative to the typical stamens that are filamentous. And this is a way in which we can kind of justify using the term primitive to describe these characteristics that we see in the Magnoliids and the basal ANA grade angiosperms. So the fourth characteristic is that there's no clear distinction between petals and sepals. I actually mentioned petals and sepals before, but one of the keys to these types of plants is that we don't see any strong distinction between them. Let's look at the magnolia flower again. So now as you look at this flower, we have some things on the outside and some things on the inside. Maybe you might want to call this one a sepal and this one a petal, but there's really no clear distinction. Okay? And in fact, we had to invent a whole new term, tepal, to refer to these neither fish nor fowl structures. And another thing about these flowers is that there's typically no set number of tepals that get arranged. We just have these tepals that are spirally arranged around the flower, right? We'll have a tepal here, we'll have the next one over here, the next one is going to come on this side, and we'll keep on building the flower, okay, putting more and more tepals around until we eventually get to the end of the tepals and we start producing the stamens. Stamens are there put around the flower in a regular position in spirals, and then we have the spirals of carpels. And this type of structure is really different from what you typically have in eudicots and monocots, where there's usually some type of set number of flowers that form a ring, right? So you might have a flower in a ring that kind of looks like this. So you've got a ring of sepals that go around the flower. Then you might have one or two whorls of petals that go on the inside of that. We don't have them spirally arranged. Spiral basically means that it's going around like this, and a whorl basically means that you have all the petals or tepals or sepals attaching at the same level in a ring. And the other thing about eudicots and monocots is that we have typically a very set number. Eudicots are very frequently in 5s or 4s, and monocots will usually have their tepals in multiples of 3. And there's a characteristic preset number. We don't find that in your typical Magnoliid flowers. Now the fifth and last characteristic is that these basal angiosperms also seem to have an inordinately high number of plants that produce terpenoid essential oils abundantly, and this makes them aromatic. I don't have any pictures of this. Star anise of the Austrobaileales is a good example. You're probably very familiar with the anise smell of licorice. Cinnamon, nutmeg, black pepper, and bay are examples that we'll come to as we talk about the Magnoliids. It just seems like smelliness is another part of this thematic pattern that helps us recognize plants that are in this ANA/Magnoliid complex of basal angiosperms. Okay, and that's pretty much it. This list comes with a disclaimer, and this disclaimer is that none of these characteristics are going to be 100% or even 75 or 70% reliable. ANA grade plants and Magnoliids will sometimes be showing the more derived character states that we see in eudicots or monocots. And a few of these primitive characteristics might also be found in various members of monocots and eudicots. This list serves really only for what we might call seat of the pants identification of plants in the field, and it won't work every time. Still, if I were to find a plant with even 2 or 3 of these characteristics, I would be shocked, absolutely shocked, to learn that it's something other than either a Magnoliid or an ANA grade plant. Now let's do a quick survey of the Magnoliids. It's the smallest of the 3 big mesangiosperm lineages with only 4 taxonomic orders, the ones I'm showing here. Right? And they contain something like 10,000 species, which sounds like a lot, but if you want to take in contrast the monocots, monocots have 11 orders with 60,000 species. And the eudicots down here contain 257,000 species, more or less, scattered across 40 different orders. So in contrast, Magnoliids are pretty tiny. 3 at least of these Magnoliid orders, not the cannellales, but everybody else, has some species that are of some significance to humans. But since there are so few of these orders, we're going to take the time to name them all. Okay? They are, as you can read here, the Magnoliales, the Laurales, the Cannellales, and the Piperelles. And starting with the Magnoliales, this is the order that contains different families. Remember, family is the next lower rank below that of order. So within the Magnoliales, we have the Magnoliaceae, and the Annonaceae, and the Myristicaceae, as well as several other families that we're not going to name. And the Magnoliaceae is obviously the one that's going to contain the genus Magnolia, and Magnolia has several different species of trees, and you can actually follow that name, right? You've got magnolia trees that belong to the family Magnoliaceae, which belong to the order Magnoliales, which belongs to this unranked grouping, the Magnoliids. And these are pretty familiar plants, right? You know what a magnolia tree looks like. We've been looking at a picture of a magnolia flower already. Another one of these families that you may be familiar with is the Annonaceae. And Annonaceae includes things like the custard apples. Okay, and I've got a picture right here. Right? This is a fruit of a cherimoya tree, okay, and it's growing outside of my friend's house in Berkeley. And cherimoya is a delicious fruit. It kind of tastes like pineapple sherbet. And there might be some of you who are into health fats. You might be taking a product called noni, which is also in the Annonaceae. But unlike cherimoya, which tastes delicious, noni tastes absolutely disgusting. And it must be really good for you, because anything that tastes bad must be really good for you, right? And so it's really not true. Okay, but noni and cherimoya and soursop are all examples of fruits within the Annonaceae that are popular, maybe not in your typical standard United States culture, but they're popular elsewhere in the world. Another family in this order besides the Annonaceae is the Myristicaceae, which is represented by our friend the nutmeg, right? You're probably familiar with this. I'm sure it's one of the ingredients in your favorite mixture of pumpkin spice. And one of the things you can see in this nutmeg, we talked about the terpenoid oils before, is that the seed contains large masses of resin that's rich in these terpenoid essential oils. It's actually an elaborate cocktail of different terpenoids that are here that gives you the characteristic smell and aroma of nutmeg. So there you have 3 families in the order Magnoliids. Now the Laurelids is a sister taxon. It's a sister order to the Magnoliids. Magnoliids are more closely related to the Laurelids, more so than they are to the other groups within the Magnoliids. Laurelids contains 4 different families. We'll only talk about one, and that's the Lauraceae. And the Lauraceae gets its name from the genus Laurus, of which we have Laurus nobilis. The bay leaves that you probably use in your cooking maybe every day is in this family. So bay laurel is one example in the Lauraceae. Okay. Another example would be a cinnamomum. A cinnamomum is the tree from which we collect the bark that gives us cinnamon. Another ingredient in your pumpkin spice. Cinnamomum is a pretty tropical tree. We don't find it in temperate areas. But if we look back not that long ago in the past, we look into the Eocene, we can actually find some examples of fossil cinnamomum. This is a fossil leaf of cinnamomum from the Eocene. This is from the Wind River Formation in Wyoming. Okay? And this kind of reminds us that in the past, climates have been very different from what they are today. Cinnamon trees would not be doing very well in Wyoming nowadays, but in the Eocene, things were considerably warmer than they are today. Not quite as warm as the Cretaceous, but they were as warm as they have ever been within the Cenozoic. And you'll find avocado trees as well. Persea is another plant. Persea is the genus that contains avocado, and this might not be an avocado tree per se, but the same type of plant was there in Wyoming in the Eocene. Now, moving away from this group over here, there's a group called the Cannellales, which is not a very important group, but I'll put a picture up anyways because it's such a pretty plant. This is Cannella winterana, and this is a plant that's native to the southern hemisphere. In fact, the entire Cannellales. Cannellales has 2 families, the Cannellaceae and the Winteraceae, and both of these have their distributions limited to the southern hemisphere. These are both plants that actually adapted pretty well to temperate climates. And these are some of the plants that presumably underwent radiations after they had dispersed to higher latitudes in the southern hemisphere, away from the equatorial belt where angiosperm diversification first originated. Now the sister order to the Cannellales is the Piperelles, of which we have the family Piperaceae, which is named after the genus Piper. Piper is most famous for giving us black pepper, Piper nigrum. Black pepper, which is there on every American table, is part of this order. Okay. And while the Magnoliids is a group, they tend to be mostly trees and larger shrubs. This order, the Piperelles, tends to be smaller plants, shrubs and vines. And this is actually pretty uncharacteristic for the Magnoliids, but you have some really tiny plants like this. Peperomia, it's a popular house plant. And Peperomia is tiny. Piper nigrum is a vine. And there are 4 other families besides the Piperaceae that we're not going to talk about. And again, we're just trying to give you a general introduction to the Piperelles. Let's leave Piper nigrum up for a little bit because I want to talk about the smelliness, which is a recurrent theme within the Magnoliids. The class of organic aromatic chemicals that we're talking about here is the terpenoids. I had this up on the previous list. Here it is. Terpenoid essential oils. It may be actually pretty thematic within the Magnoliids, but this class of chemicals is not limited to Magnoliids at all. As a class of chemicals, it's a pretty broad one. We find it very, very broadly within life. But from conifers to eudicots, the most abundant chemical natural products fall into this terpenoid family. Now there's a whole field, the chemistry of plants or phytochemistry. It's incredibly complicated. You could spend your lifetime researching the diversity of plant-produced compounds, discovering a new one every week, and at the end of your career you would still have not even come close to covering the entire expanse. So at the same time that we have this enormous complexity overall, the vast majority of these plant-produced aromatic compounds belongs just to one class of organic chemicals, the terpenoids. And I would say that the most characteristic of plant smells that you can recognize are mostly a combination of only 3 major terpenoids. One of them is piperine, which is the predominant spicy scent we find in black pepper. The second major terpenoid is limonene, which is the citrusy scent we find in lemons and oranges. And then the third one we have is pinene, which gives you that evergreen scent, which is the principal aromatic we find in pines. And if you take these three main terpenoids in combination and tweak their concentrations and maybe add one or two additional compounds, you can create an enormous diversity of different smells. And these are the smells that your nose is attuned to recognize. The difference between black pepper and cinnamon and bay leaves and nutmeg really doesn't amount to much more than slightly different combinations of those three main chemicals. Now there's one more pretty significant difference between these plants and the majority of eudicots and monocots, and this has to deal with how they get pollinated. In eudicots and monocots, the most common vectors for pollen are going to be one of two things: wind or bees. When you look at Magnoliids and the ANA grade plants, they rarely use bees or wind. Insect pollination does tend to be most common for the group, but instead of bees, the kinds of insects that they use would be flies or beetles or butterflies or thrips, which are tiny, tiny winged plant-sucking insects. There's some Magnoliids, like the pipers, the plants closely related to black pepper, that have evolved to rely heavily on bat pollination, but the majority would be using one of those non-bee types of insects. As a final footnote, I want to add that the Chloranthales, this group, which is one of the two minor clades of angiosperms that aren't part of any of the three major groups. I actually mentioned the Chloranthales in a previous lesson when we talked about Field's dark and disturbed model for the origin of angiosperms. The Chloranthales, and I've got a picture here of Sarcandra glabra, I believe. It's a pretty small and insignificant group nowadays, but they were one of the earliest angiosperms to be around in fairly high abundances, at least based on what the fossil record is showing us. To summarize, the Magnoliids consist of around 10,000 species of plants that are mostly tropical or subtropical, except for the cannellillies, which contain some plants that are adapted to freezing. Generally speaking, they tend to have a spicy smelliness imparted by the terpenoids. But then again, there are lots of other plants that do this as well. They also tend to have a relatively unremarkable leaf shape and plant structure. Now, if you happen to find a flower, you really have your best shot at recognizing a Magnoliid because of these primitive floral characteristics that they share with the ANA grade angiosperms. Basically, there aren't any obvious or easy fail-safe tricks to recognizing a Magnoliid or ANA grade plant, and that's just the way it is. Okay? The next two groups that we get to, the monocots and the eudicots, are much better, or I really should say easier, at recognizing because they have some pretty characteristic, hallmark characteristics, synapomorphies that can be used for identification purposes. Actually, that's only true of the monocots, right? Monocots are easy to recognize, but if you know that it's not a monocot, you know that it's not a Magnoliid, you could pretty much figure out that it's going to be eudicot. Much more plant identification coming up. Hold on to your seats.